Alright, welcome everybody. It's time for another live cast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. Once again, I am still Josh Bycer, and we got a great cast for you this evening. Our topic is going to be discussing the challenges of writing custom engines for video games and the work that goes into it. And I'm definitely excited about this one because, as I've said before, I am not a programmer by trade. And it's always interesting to learn stuff outside of your own field of expertise. But joining me tonight, he is the designer on the game Deceiver, as well as a programmer who has written several custom game engines. Please welcome to the cast, Evan Todd.
Hello.
Hi, Evan. It's great to have you on. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing?
I am doing well. I am going to probably be tired after this whole cast is over. This is cast number 2 for me this week.
Oh, wow. So do you normally cast once a week?
I try to do at least one developer live cast a week, and then of course my daily streams and stuff like that. So
Okay.
my voice is going to be dead by what I'm going to be doing tonight.
Nice.
But
Worth it.
yeah, it's always great to talk to developers, as the fans watching probably know. But it's great to have you on, and thank you for reaching out to me on Twitter as well.
Yeah, no problem.
Alright, so we got a lot to talk about. So to begin with, for people who don't know who you are, Evan, could you talk a little bit about your background when it comes to game design in the industry?
Sure. So yeah, I got a computer science and engineering degree. I graduated in 2012, and then I worked for an iPhone game studio for a year. We made free-to-play iPhone games, and then in 2014, I quit and went indie, and I've been indie ever since. So,
And like I just said a few seconds ago, you're currently working on the game Deceiver, right?
correct. Yep. It is it's a crazy. Some people we call it laser crabs. Laser crabs the game.
Great. We'll talk a little bit more about that probably in the next few minutes. But as I said at the start, we're going to be talking about working on custom engines. And I guess what attracted you to working on your own custom engine as opposed to using what a lot of people consider to be the defaults, Unity, Game Maker, stuff like that.
Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Originally, I mean, I started making games when I was a kid, and back when I was a kid, there was no Unity, there was no Unreal, and so I went to the library. Didn't have internet even really, so I went to the library and got books, and the books taught, here's how you make a game. You write everything from scratch, and so that's how I got started, and then I just kind of kept doing that. So that's probably the root cause.
Great. Again, it's very interesting to talk to developers who've been around for so long, because again, for a lot of people who are on the younger side learning about game design today, again, they're usually taught, find a game engine, find Game Maker, Unity, even Unreal in some cases, and go from there. And I'm going to have a lot of noob related questions for you tonight, Evan, about
Sure,
custom
sure.
engines, because like I said, for myself, I understand programming logic. I took some programming classes back in high school and college, but when it comes to actually taking your thoughts and putting to code, that's where my brain, it just stops. It just dies right there. So it's always interesting to learn more about this, because as anyone who's watching this knows, programming is pretty much one of the 3 main tracks of making a video game. Of course, the other 2 being design and art. So,
Don't
I
forget
get.
sound.
Oh yeah, of course, sound. Or I'm sorry, it's not just art; it's aesthetics. That's better. That's the
Aesthetic.
more. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into. Again, we could easily have podcasts for each track and then some. I know. Again, for those of you watching this, we've had who knows how many podcasts on game design at this point in time. But
How long have you been doing this? How long has this been around?
I've been doing Game Wisdom since 2012. The YouTube
Wow.
channel has been since 2016, so I started to get serious. But yeah,
Wow.
I have been interviewing game developers for a very long time.
Cool. I'll have to check out the backlog. It's exciting.
Good luck with that one. Let's just say that. And I think you may be there for a while. But hopefully we'll get some questions from chat. But while we're waiting, and excuse me, before we get to our main topic, then for Deceiver, I guess how long have you been working on that game?
That started in Actually, it started as a 7-day FPS project. I'm not sure if you remember that back in 2014. 7-day
No.
FPS. Okay, it was a week-long game jam, and you were supposed to make a first-person shooter in a week. And so in November 2014, I did a prototype, and it was actually written in Unity. And then I in 2015 I started turning it into a full thing. So it's been almost 3 years that I've been working on it full time.
Hmm. Interesting. And you already mentioned the idea of laser crafts before, but for people interested in playing Deceiver, I guess what's the general gameplay of it?
Sure. The core idea is that you know it's a shooter, but instead of firing bullets, you fire yourself. You just launch yourself at the enemy, and so you're these kind of spider bot things that can launch. You can crawl on the walls and ceilings, and then you can launch from surface to surface, and you attack by just kind of smashing into the enemy.
Hmm. And I was looking at a few screenshots. It has like that very like a wireframe kind of aesthetic to it, right?
Yeah.
I guess what attracted you to that aesthetic for the game as opposed to other art styles?
I think the first time I saw that style was the Tron 2.0 video game
Yes.
back in like early 2000s, I think. And I just really liked the I don't know if you're familiar with that. I really
Oh
liked
yeah.
the neon lines in
Hmm.
that game. And I guess I'd always been kind of enamored with that visual style, and so yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember Tron 2.0. At some point, I need to make a video on because that was one of my favorite FPSs of the last decade.
I don't remember it being particularly fun or not. I think I had maybe a potato computer at the time and couldn't even probably play it properly. But I just remember the visuals being really awesome.
Yeah, that's how my computer responds if I try to load up Doom 2016. I start to see
Uh,
the smoke flying, and I hear the gear starting to break in there.
yeah, that's a great game from what I've heard. I have not played the new Doom, but
Uh,
I've heard it's
I guess so. Before we move on, then I guess what attracted you to turning Deceiver into a full game? Because that's another very interesting topic. That for fans of game wisdom, we've talked about this in terms of how do you measure if an idea is good enough to take it to that next step.
right. So how do you choose which prototypes
Hmm.
become full things and which do you just let die?
Hmm.
Is that the
Yeah.
question or
Hmm.
yeah? Um, Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I don't know if I have that answer because uh, I mean, if you talk, so some good people that do know the answers to that question would be Ryan Clark, who made or who was kind of the head guy behind Crypt of the Necro Dancer, and he has this whole Gama Sutra article. I'm sure you might have seen it
Hmm.
that talks about how do you know what to make, and it's a lot of like market analysis and what do people like and what's out there already, what's niche and what is like an unserved market and things like that. And for me, it was more of a kind of a artistic thing, or like I just want to make a game that's like this, and that's not necessarily the right way to do it because it doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to make any money off of it.
Of course, I know I've heard that one before. And what's very interesting, Evan, about you said that you came up with the story in the 7-day FPS game jam. It reminds you of the story of Superhot. Did you have a chance to play that one?
Yes, yes, I did, and it's really great. Honestly, I like the prototype more than I like the final game. But yeah, that was kind of the dream was to become a super hot, but they're amazing. So I didn't quite reach that.
Well, hopefully I will be able to talk more about Deceiver as it's finishing up. I guess, do you have an estimated date for when it's out? Or is it out already?
There's a demo out on Steam right now. Actually, just today the demo got approved by Valve. So yeah, you can play it. But the final version is going to be at least a year in development.
Okay. Well, definitely the best of luck on that, Evan. And I'm curious to see how things evolve again from where you started to how we'll end up at 1.0.
Yeah, me too. You and me both.
But I think with that, let's get to our main topic because that I think is what we're going to be spending the bulk of our conversation on, and that is, of course, coming up and writing custom engines for games. Now, on your Twitter profile, or I think what we talked about, you've made custom game engines for 3D titles, right?
Correct.
All right. Now, I guess my first question, this is my super noob question that may just drive you off the cast right
Perfect.
away.
Perfect.
But as someone who, again, is not familiar with the programming side of game design, when we say writing a custom engine, what exactly do you do as a programmer in that case? Like, what exactly are you making when you say that you're making your own custom engine?
Well, it kind of varies.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, nothing is you, nothing really exists from scratch. Like you can't, you know, some people do. It depends on how much you want to do. If you want, you can start by writing your own text editor, or your own programming language. And the people that I'm following right now are doing just that. So Jonathan Blow is an example. He's right now working on a language, programming language specifically designed for games. And then you've got Casey Muratori, who is using a custom text editor, and he's got his so this whole idea of custom engines and things is kind of the poster child for it is called the handmade movement, and kind of led by Casey Muratori, and he has a stream called Handmade Hero where he's making a game from scratch, and one of the stream episodes he literally is like modifying his text editor. He uses something called 4Coder, and he didn't like how it worked, and so he's like, you know what, I'm gonna change the way this text editor works, and so it depends on how crazy you want to get, how deep the rabbit hole goes. I guess if you really want to go and write your own programming language, you can do that. Now for me, it's not quite that crazy. So
Yeah, I mean, my brain is just starting to fry thinking about like my attempt at trying to do something like that. I mean, I did a little bit of stuff in Unity, and the most I came up with was a red square floating across a track, jumping over blue rectangles. That was
yeah, that's
the
pretty good.
extent of my programming expertise.
Yeah,
But
that's pretty good.
yeah, I can certainly sell that on Steam tomorrow. Let me put that
Yeah,
up there. Oh, who knows? With a lot of the shovelware games on there, maybe I can go viral somehow.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But getting back to the topic, like speaking about Unity, that's actually a really good question I was thinking about. This is another noob one for you. When when I think of a game engine, I again think of something like Unity or Game Maker, where I have the whole interface in front of me. I can put stuff on the screen. I can go in and make codes, or I'm sorry, make programming on top of the objects. When you're making a custom game engine, are you basically designing that interface as well? Are you basically creating the tools that you're using to then build the game?
It depends on the person. So some people will try and write their own custom engine, meaning with an editor,
Okay.
and so you know, they'll write a whole interface and a level designer that they can drag things around and all that, and it'll look a lot like Game Maker or Unity.
Okay.
I don't do that because that's a lot of work, and so I with this engine, usually the way I start is I find a tutorial online that does what I need to do, and so this game, for example, I knew I wanted animated characters. So I started with a tutorial that just had an animated character on screen. And then I kind of rip that apart and dissect it and turn it and change it into what I need it to do.
Okay.
Go from there.
So in your case with the work that you're doing, there is no like editor, like again like something like Unity or Game Maker. So I guess again here's my super novice question then. What are you like looking at when you're designing the game? I know that's a stupid
Sure.
question. I know Mike right now in chat, who's one of my regulars, who's also a programmer, he's probably slapping his head right now listening to me say that.
Sure, yeah. No. So for the most part, I'm staring at Visual Studio, which is
Okay.
just code. It's nothing but code.
Okay.
Um, but for laying out levels, I do need a way to place objects in the world and things like that. And so for that, I actually use Blender, which is a free 3D modeling program, and I just have my engine is capable of reading data from that,
Okay.
importing data from that is how that goes.
All right. Now that I do recognize because I remember back in high school I did do some stuff in I think I think it was C Sharp or C++. I think it was in one of the older versions of Visual Studio. So that's
Okay.
basically what you're then using. You're basically using the code editor then, and then that gets exported to Blender to then create what you've done, I guess.
Kind of the other way. So
Okay.
your game is written in code in Visual Studio,
Okay.
and then Blender, is for creating the levels, and then my game will read stuff from Blender into the game.
Oh.
It's Yeah.
Okay. Now I guess here's a question for you. As I said a few minutes ago, like you work with 3D, creating a 3D engine for
Sure.
various games. Is there a difference? Obviously, when I look at Unity, it is built in 3D. I know, again, Game Maker is in 2D. Is there a difference doing custom work in 2D versus 3D if you are just using like a code editor like Visual Studio?
Um, it is weird because graphics cards these days, when you're writing a game, there's really no difference between 2D and 3D.
Hmm.
And actually, if you're using Unity, it's kind of clunky to work in
Yeah.
2D in Unity. I don't know if you've tried this.
I've when I was trying to do my stuff and from the tutorials I read, yeah, just because of the fact that Unity is always in 3D, so it's kind of like you have
Right,
to flatten it and adjust the camera, so it's kind of like a faux 2D.
right, right. Well, so that's actually how graphics cards work in general. Like everything is 3D, and when you're playing a 2D game, it just happens to be everything's flat. You know.
Yeah.
So the way that Unity does it is kind of actually how it works. Um,
Hmm.
so, but if you're writing a custom engine, you can do things that make it easier to work in 2D. And like in Game Maker, they just kind of hide all of that third dimension. You don't have to worry about it. So you can do that if you want.
Hmm. Now, I'm seeing some of the comments in chat. When it comes to, I guess, going back to what you said a few minutes ago regarding like actually designing your own language, that is something that again seems crazy, at least from my perspective. I guess how do you even begin like approaching something like that? Like I don't even know like a question to actually start off with that. And like what actually begins like if you want to actually write your own custom language for a game?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a whole different level, and that's not something that I'm like capable of doing. But I think the only reason that Jonathan Blow is able to attempt it right now is that he's done this several times before. Over the course of his career, he's worked on different languages, and uh, and I think that's really the key with custom engines and really like game programming in general. Like, I've made a number of engines at this point, and each time you get a little bit better because you know what to expect and okay, I'm going to need this, I'm going to need that, and you might even reuse stuff from an older engine. And so each time you do it, you get a little bit better at it. And I think that's what Jonathan Blow has done with these programming languages is that he's made a number of these over the years, and each time he's like, well, there were some problems with that last one, and so I'm going to fix that with this new language, and now he's finally, he's been programming for what 25 years or whatever, and now he's just now finally getting to the point where he's like, I think I can make a good language, and we'll see if that happens or not.
It definitely sounds like definitely sounds very involved. And again, this what we're talking about, like for my general audience, like we're not even at the point where you're designing a game yet. You're just basically
Right.
designing the tools to then use to design the game.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I kind of view. I used to think of it that way. I used to think like, okay, I'm going to write this engine and it's going to be reusable. So
Yeah.
I try to keep the engine code separate from the game code.
Hmm.
And I can reuse all this engine code in my next game. It's going to be great. And what I found is that it generally doesn't work that way. And if because different engines are designed for different things. Unity is very it tries to be very general
Hmm.
and useful for a lot of different types of games, but um, some things it's just not going to be able to do. So an example would be the Star Citizen. I don't know if you've ever seen that game.
Yeah, I did.
Star Citizen, yeah. So they used the Cry engine, but they ended up having to heavily modify it because it was just not able to do what they needed to do because it's designed to make first-person shooter games. and not giant space games. And so um, that's an example of like the engine and the game, I think, kind of all tie together. And that's kind of part of this whole handmade movement is like ideally you need to understand every layer
Yeah.
that's going into your game, all the way down from what programming language you're using and what hardware you're running on, how does the processor work, all that stuff, all the way up to, the final game design.
Hmm. And what you just said there, Evan, about reusing engines, that's another thing that I've heard several indie developers talk about in terms of their strategies. Again, creating their own custom engine to then work on their game to then reuse it for a future one. I guess, again, as a novice when it comes to this, like, how easy is it to I guess reuse your engine for another game? Like, is it just a matter of just thinking about the code differently, or is there work that needs to be done, like switching genres or switching to a new game design using the same engine?
Well, it depends on the engine, and it depends on how well it's written, and also it depends on how big of a change you're making. So if you're going from a first-person shooter engine to a open world
Mm-hmm.
engine, for example, that's a huge thing where you're probably going to have to make a lot of changes. Um, but if you're making another first-person shooter, you can reuse probably a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it just depends on what kind of things it's going to be used for.
Okay. Now, here is another very beginner's question. I kind of know the answer to this one myself, but I think this is a great one to bring up for anyone, maybe students or new people watching this right now. But when we say game engine, what exactly is that? When in the scope of developing a game, like, what does that mean for someone in terms of what it does for a video game?
Game engine incorporates everything that kind of makes the game tick, and it's kind of a fuzzy line. At
Mm-hmm.
least, especially in the case of my game, the engine and the game code are like they're very closely tied together. And so, if you're using Unity, it's much more clearly delineated. This is where the engine stops and the game begins. But in my case, they're very closely tied together.
Okay.
And so it is hard to come up with a good definition. That's a very tricky question,
I
actually.
know.
But yeah, I would say it's the it's the code that it's kind of like the plumbing. It's behind the scenes. It's the most obvious thing is like anything having to do with graphics. That's usually what people think of when they think of a game engine is like it's the thing that renders uh, onto the screen. But there's so much more involved. So there would be graphics, physics engine. That would be a prime candidate for something that's like easily reusable.
Mm-hmm.
Anything having to do with like objects colliding and like physical interactions and stuff. That's probably in its own little chunk, that can be reused.
Like, would AI behavior also be factored into the game engine?
Sometimes it is, but I would probably not count that because, well, and I'm sure you're familiar, so often in game design, the AI is actually incredibly simplistic.
Yes.
Um, there are some games that are quite sophisticated. The games that have sophisticated AI are very game specific. So they're coding in specific behaviors for the specific game and all that kind of stuff. And so I would not probably count the AI in there, but sometimes game engines have tools that make it easier to write AI. Like an example would be behavior trees, where instead of writing the AI in code, you can kind of connect things together visually and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So
Yeah. Mike in chat said that for his analogy, the game engine is an operating system, and the game itself is an application within that. Would you agree with
that's a
that?
good way. That's a good way to look at it. But like I said, in my case, that's not really how it works at all. They're very closely tied. It's not really much of a difference.
Mm. And Mike also asks, Evan, how do you find developing while streaming your game?
Oh, I think it's a lot of fun, and I think it's great. Um, it forces you to focus, so you're not going to alt tab over to YouTube while you're streaming. So that's good. And then sometimes people will correct me on stream, or they'll see where I made a mistake and like, hey, or I'll be stuck on something, and sometimes someone will jump in and tell me like what's going on. The craziest one was I was talking about so one of the skills you need as a game developer is making GIFs. Very important. And so I was talking about making GIFs, and I was using this program called ShareX, and I was showing people how to use it. Like, oh yeah, ShareX is great, but I was complaining. I was like, I wish there was this one feature, and I don't even remember what it was. I just wish it did blank. And all of a sudden, somebody in the Twitch chat jumped in, and he's like, "Oh hey, I make ShareX. Yeah, I'll put that in." And like that night, like a new patch came out, and it had this new feature in it. And I was like, "Are you kidding me?"
Oh man, that reminds me when I do we used to do developer live streams where we play the game with the developer on there, and we
Yeah.
will find without fail, we will find a bug that the developer
Oh yeah.
didn't know existed,
I'm
and we will
sure.
get hit by it live.
Yeah. I'm sure that happens every time.
Of course it does. But when it comes to creating an engine, I guess here's a very interesting question. Obviously, for people who watch our streams, or I'm sorry, our live casts and our recorded talks, we've talked about the challenges of knowing when a game is done, when you're finished designing a game, when you're ready to put a 1.0. But game engine is a completely different topic. Again, it's the tools and the what you're trying to build your game around. So I guess for you, Evan, I'm sure Mike will probably have some comments as well. Like, how do you know when the engine is done, or is it ever at a point of being like 100% finished?
Yeah. Engine, I think, is one of those things that is never really finished because you can always optimize it further, and there's just always like nitty gritty details about, oh, it doesn't, like on Linux, in this certain driver configuration, the window size is messed up or whatever. Like there's so many zillions of tiny things that you could always improve. Um, so yeah, I would say that the engine isn't really ever finished, but usually you get to a point where you're like, okay, I've got pretty much every feature I need, and now I can kind of focus on the game. So there's kind of a point where you get like 80% of what you need, and you can start working on the game, and then you kind of finish that 20% over as the game itself develops.
Hmm. And I'm sure as a programmer, it definitely must be challenging to be thinking about your design at the same time you're writing your engine. I know speaking to other developers about sometimes that work of building your game is sometimes knowing what you can do versus what you can't do. And this is when you're working with, another engine, like you're working with Unity or Game Maker or so on. But again, with the work you're doing with your own engines, do you have that challenge of knowing I want to do this in the game, but I know what my engine can do. So do I adjust the engine or do I adjust my design?
Right. Yeah, and that's a big question because yeah, writing your own technology kind of opens up a lot more doors. And in game development, with design, you generally want to close as many doors as you can. You want to
Yeah.
limit yourself and constrain yourself. And so, it is hard to have the discipline when you think like, oh man, I could have what if I could have 1,000 thingies, a
Yeah.
1,000 characters running in my game. Like, well, in Unity maybe you'd be like, well, I can't really do that. But you have your own engine. It's like, well, I could change the way the code works, and change the
Yeah.
rendering engine to make it work. So I think it makes things more difficult. But on the other hand, um, it can be, once you kind of have nailed down what the engine can do, it's great for, since you know how it works underneath the hood, you're never going to do something that the engine doesn't like.
Hmm.
You're not going to. Some people, especially new people in Unity, they don't know what's slow and what's fast in Unity, and so they'll create a million things of a certain type, and they don't know that that's really inefficient. But since you've written the engine yourself and you know what it likes to do and what it doesn't like to do, you're going to give it exactly what it wants.
Hmm. Mike asked in chat that he missed the very beginning. What was the first engine that you worked with?
First engine. So I started out actually uh, writing HTML,
Hmm.
and I still recommend that for people interested in learning. It's a really great way to start because all you need is Notepad, and you can just write a web page and like all you need is a browser, and you just open it up and refresh, and you get instant visual feedback, you know. So that's how I started, and then the first time I realized I could make a game was um, HTML. You know, you can have a table of images, and I realized I could use JavaScript and change each image in the cell. So I could, you know, I could change the um, you know, one of the cells to a player image, and then I could like, you know, clear that out and change the cell beneath it to be the player image, you know. And so I basically turned a web page into a video game was the first thing I did. So yeah, not
Nice.
really custom engine, but
Now, I guess another general question for you, Evan. Like, is there a typical time frame that you spend developing the engine, or is it completely variable based on what you're trying to do?
historically it's been the engine develops kind of at the same time as the game. So um, there's a certain beginning period which is always fun and exciting where uh, you know, you kind of have to do all engine stuff. You're trying to like fabricate, you know, you need like math functions. You know, you have to like implement multiplication or whatever.
Hmm.
So you're kind of having the basic building blocks, and then after the very pretty like fairly early on, after you have the very early basic building blocks, you can start doing. At least for me, I start trying to make it playable like as soon as possible,
Hmm.
and just really simple stuff. Um, so yeah, the engine in the game, in my experience, develop as you go.
Okay. Now, here is a question, I guess, that is a little bit lately one, but one thing I have to ask since we have a programmer on, is it really, as people say, easy to create multiplayer in a single weekend, as all the gamers on Twitter like to complain about? Or is there a lot more work in that?
Uh, yeah, it's really hard. Um, and it's really hard even if you start from the beginning with multiplayer in mind, which is how you're supposed to do it.
Hmm.
Um, but it's especially hard to take an existing game that was not designed with multiplayer in mind and add multiplayer to it. It's most people just tell you just don't even think about it
Yeah.
because um, yeah, if you're not thinking about that ahead of time, it's just going to be really difficult. Now, depending on the game, sometimes it can be fairly easy. So if you're using Unity, you know they have a lot of built-in stuff. If you're using like HTML5, a lot of times that can be fairly easy. But the other thing you got to think about is, you know, there's also all of that UI for connecting, and are you going to do dedicated servers, and you have to, you know, spin those servers up and host them, and you got to deploy updates to the servers and all this crazy stuff that
Yeah.
goes along with it.
Mm.
Um, One of the most difficult things is just getting a connection between two computers. It's insane to do that. One of my first games, I tried to do that, and I didn't realize that it's by default it's very difficult to get two computers on the internet to talk to each other. Now, if one of those computers is a server, it makes it a lot easier. But just two random people, it's like impossible. If there's no server between them, it's impossible. So, um, yeah, you need to know about server administration and that kind of stuff too. There's a
Oh,
whole gob of
yes.
wax. It's crazy.
Oh, yes. That, again, that is a topic for that's an easy another hour, 2 hour
Yeah.
podcast right there. So, actually, for any developers watching this, that is a really good topic I'd like to talk about. So, if anyone has done work with that and would like to come on and talk, please get in touch with me because, again, that's another major aspect, especially in today's market with so many people wanting multiplayer in their games. Now, Mike asked in chat, tightly coupling engine with the game makes it harder to use it. What are your plans, I guess, with your engine?
Um, from what I found, it's like I said, you know, some engines are made to do certain things,
Hmm.
and you know, so my last game I sold it on Steam. It was a voxel engine, and I originally started out trying to make it reusable, thinking like, oh yeah, I'll totally use this engine again for something else. And then it turned out like by the time I was done, I had learned so much, and like the you know I, the project took 5 years, and so when I started out, I was still in college, still learning so much stuff. By the time I was done, I had learned a whole lot, and I was like, man, this engine sucks. Like, I'm not going to reuse this. I'm going to write a whole new one. And so, but even if it was good quality, like the next game didn't have voxels in it, and the whole engine was built on voxels, you know. And so it's like, what am I even going to reuse? I can't even reuse any of it. So I don't really try to plan for reusability anymore. But you know, my approach for this engine, if I were to reuse it, it would be to reuse parts of it. So, you know, I have netcode, like networking. I have a whole system, and I would just kind of tear that out of the old game. Basically, just kind of delete all the gameplay code and kind of start fresh. You know, a blank, empty window with just the parts that I can reuse. So like physics engine, networking, threading stuff, like graphics, you know, those are things that I can easily reuse. And I can, you know, I say that the engine and the game are tightly coupled, but I think it wouldn't take me more than like 3 days to just go through and just delete, because deleting is easy, right?
Of course
just
it is.
delete all your gameplay code, and you're kind of left with stuff that you can reuse. I don't think it would take me long to do that.
Okay. Mike also asks, how many engines have you built?
How many engines? It's hard to say. So the first one, the first 3D engine, I kind of copy pasted it out of a library book, and it was actually a 3D a software renderer. So that was one, and then I did some DirectX stuff, and I failed, and then I tried again with DirectX, and then I used an engine called Panda 3D. Well, so you're asking engines, so that one doesn't count. And then I used XNA, which it was a custom engine kind of written on top of XNA, and then there's this one, and then I've made some smaller jam games that used varying amounts. It's hard to say like how much you've written yourself and how much you're using stuff that's already out there.
All right. Now, two general questions I have for you, Evan, because I'm sure if anyone is watching this, they'll probably wondering this as well. The first one is, we've kind of been talking of like bits and pieces of this, but just to, I guess, clarify everything, if you were to talk to someone about using a custom engine or building yourself versus using a handmade one, what would you say would be like the biggest pros and cons of each approach?
Biggest thing I would say is it has to do with the size of the project. So if you're making a small prototype, or even a fairly like mid-sized game, pretty much actually most of the time I'm going to tell you to just use an engine. And the other thing is, so size of the game matters, because what I've found is that my projects tend to be really long. Like that one project lasted 5 years, and by the time, you know, with that scale of a project, you end up rewriting a lot of stuff anyways, because, you know, it doesn't work the way that you know, the built-in engine stuff doesn't work the way that you want it to. So for example, you know, my last game was all voxels, and I needed like pathfinding stuff. Well, Unity has pathfinding stuff built in, but it's very specific. It works in a very specific way. It didn't work with voxels, and so I wouldn't even, you know, it gives me no benefit. And so if you have a project like that that's like massive scale, then yeah, write your own engine, because it's, you know, you'll learn more and it'll be, yeah, I don't know. But for most people, if you're interested in writing a game and you're not interested in the technical parts of it, then totally use an engine. So I think a big part of game development for me is like do whatever makes you happy, kind of, because it's so hard to maintain motivation, and it's so hard to keep going. I mean, game development is unbelievably hard in general. So whatever you can do that makes it more enjoyable for you, then do that. So if you like nitty-gritty technical stuff, do it. You know, write your own engine. And if you don't like that stuff, then use an existing engine.
All right. Now, here's another big question I want to ask you about, Evan. One of the things that we've seen, especially from the outside, is, of course, people sell, as you know, being able to buy and sell like the engines or the editors for, again, Unity, of course, has their versions. Unreal, Game Makers, of course, I think you can buy the actual engine, but there's like student discounts and stuff like that. Is like, what's it like to actually like sell like a game engine? Like, is that something that is possible, or is it again something that's so specific that there's not really a market for it, like outside again of the respective game?
I've never sold a game engine, so
Okay.
um, it's very so I think there's basically, we've got the two main players. We've got Unity and Unreal kind of for large scale stuff. But then I think if you're interested in selling an engine, there is a market for engines that are easier to use for beginners.
Hmm.
Um, so good example is Godot or Godot, depending on your pronunciation. It's a new engine, and it's open source and it's free. But people are so excited about it that they're backing the Patreon, and this guy's able to work on it full time. And I think the reason people are so excited about it is because it's less complicated than Unity or Unreal. It's just easier. And so I think, and there's a lot of these like beginner engines
Yeah.
that work with like HTML5 and kind of drag and drop stuff. Game Maker is a perfect example. I think if you're interested in selling an engine, there is a market, but it's only at the level of like creative, like beginner stuff. If you're trying to compete with Unity and Unreal, it's you have a bad time.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there, Evan, about more beginner level software. Like one of the biggest revelations for me that I saw was Super Mario Maker on the Wii U a few years ago, and that felt like it was like one of the first times we saw, at least in the mainstream, that it's essentially the Mario engine completely divorced from programming, and you can again, as you said, drag and drop features on there, and you're doing it all yourself. And I would love again to see more of that develop, even as a way just to get people's feet in the door when it comes to being able to actually go from idea to putting it on screen. Because again, the problem with Mario Maker, of course, it's all Mario. Like I'm not going to be using the Mario Maker engine and making the next Star Fox or the next Doom. And being able to do something like that, I think, would be a very amazing step.
Oh yeah.
Um, I guess here's something. I'm going to date myself once again. Did you ever hear of the software Click and Play, developed by
Yeah.
Maxis? Yeah, I actually had that back in the day, but I think I was just too young at the time to actually try and do something with it.
Yeah, stuff like that is really exciting. And a lot of times you'll talk to like professional developers in the industry, and they're like they're developing like Dark Souls or whatever, and you ask them like how they got started, and they're like, yeah, I was like 8 years old, and I started like messing around with some. I remember one of my friends like started messing around with like on PlayStation. There was a game where you could create your own music, and he's like, yeah, I just started messing around with that, and pretty soon they start hitting the limits of what you can do with that thing, and then they're like, all right, I got to find something better, and they find like Pro Tools or whatever, and then so I think a lot of people start out as kids, you know, yeah, me, I started out with like Game Maker, just dragging and dropping stuff, and then eventually you're like, man, I want to do something more, and then you find the next thing.
Okay. Got a few questions in chat for you, Evan. Mike asks, what's your opinion on targeting consoles or mobile?
Ooh, I would love to be on consoles. I'm part of the PS4 developer program, but I just haven't. It's, I don't have the resources to port my game to PS4 right now. Mobile, I'm just not interested in right now. It's really hard to make any money on mobile, and um,
That's probably another podcast in of itself if we start talking about mobile markets.
yeah, mobile's very very difficult. It's fun and exciting for some things, getting people who you don't traditionally think of as gamers to play things, like Monument Valley is a great example of a just like a really beautiful game, and it would be awesome to make something like that kind of is very accessible and lots of people are able to play it, but it's there's some survivorship bias there where you're like, you think Monument Valley, you don't think of the millions, literally
Oh,
millions of
yes.
people who are making nothing, and they put years of their life into it and nothing happens, and it's really difficult.
Hmm. Oscar has a few questions for you. What's your opinion on sites selling asset libraries, and have you used other people's assets? I think you already answered that second part, though.
Um, I don't have a problem with sites selling asset libraries. I mean, there's some really great stuff out there. One that I know is Kenny.nl, and he just sells. They call him Asset Jesus, and he has a bunch of a, a large amount of his stuff is out there for free. But he also sells asset packs, and I think it's great. Especially for classrooms and stuff. Like you don't really care about the art. I just want to focus on mechanics. It's like boom, drop some really nice looking assets in there. Me, I haven't really used asset libraries for my own game. Um, I have used one thing I don't do is sound, and I have used like freesound.org, which is a fantastic resource. So I think there's nothing but good for asset libraries. The only thing, like, I guess you're probably asking about like asset flippers,
Yeah.
and that's, I don't have anything against someone using assets in a game or just kind of doing like an asset flip. The issue is more of with Valve and how they curate things.
Hmm.
If you want to make an asset flip and put it on the internet, that's totally fine. But when it starts clogging up Steam,
Hmm.
that's when have a little bit of an issue. And so many people are saying like, I never see asset flips on Steam because there's filtering and all this stuff, and that is true. But the one thing, sorry, I'm getting way off into Steam stuff. Do we want to talk about Steam?
We could talk for a few minutes. Let me check our time. We're about 50 minutes, and yeah, we could spend a few minutes on there quickly.
Okay. Well, all I wanted to say was like, it's like the broken windows hypothesis. So when someone, back say 5, 8 years ago, someone lands on a Steam page, they are kind of guaranteed a certain level of quality, and they know if the game doesn't work, I can email, or I can get help for this game, and like I know it's going to work. Maybe it's not the most fun game in the world, but like I know it's going to be quality, some amount of quality. And now when you land on a Steam page, even if it's a good indie game, there's this doubt in your mind. Even if you see a lot of positive reviews, you don't know if those are like meme reviews where they're just uploading it ironically, like this is great, it's a piece of garbage. So there's this kind of extra doubt in your mind that just makes it that much more difficult for them to press the buy button.
Yeah.
So that's my theory anyway. I don't know.
All right. Getting back. Oh wait. Here's a question from Mike, and then I have a few more questions for you. How do you structure your code? Object oriented or data/functions driven?
Yeah, this is something that I'm in the middle of learning. I used to be 100% object oriented, and this probably doesn't have any meaning to you, but yeah, I used to. Object oriented is just a way of organizing code that just focuses on chunking things into objects. So you have a player object, and then you have a bullet object, and you have an enemy object.
And each one has essentially their own code associated with it that
Right.
defines it.
Right. So each object has, and you can think about this if you've ever used GameMaker. You know, each object in GameMaker has properties. For example, it can have a number that represents its health, and then it has a number that represents the X position, the Y position. It's got different data associated with it, and then you can also drag behaviors onto it. So you can make it jump when you press a button or whatever. So an object is like a collection of behaviors and data together,
Yeah.
right, all clumped together. And so the alternative to that is this idea of like what he's talking about, data and functions, which is sometimes things aren't perfectly like clumped together in an object. Like for example, when a bullet hits a player, does that behavior go onto the bullet or does it go onto the player? And you kind of have to make this call, and it's kind of an arbitrary decision. And really, that behavior has to do with both of them. So what it really should be is like a function or like a process that happens to both of them. It shouldn't be attached to either one of them individually. It's kind of transcending, I guess.
I think I know what you're talking about. Again, like I said, I've done a little bit of programming, but I'm certainly by no means not even a novice. I gotta get Oscar's comment in a second, but the idea is that instead of having the code chunk on either one, you create a function that will then read the data in. It's kind of like wherever it's coming from, we'll put that data in, and then the function itself will then make use of whatever that data is. So
Hmm.
it's kind of I'm going to really, I don't know if I'm going to impress Mike or he's going to slap his head, but is that kind of the idea of like polymorphism when it comes to programming? Or is that a different idea?
Polymorphism is a kind of a complicated thing, and yeah, it's not quite the. I mean, yeah, it's kind of a separate issue, but
Okay.
yeah, and all these ideas are really just different ways of organizing your code, and I think, you know, when you go to school, they'll teach you this object way,
Yeah.
and they kind of teach it as a dogma, and so you're kind of stuck thinking that way. And then, just recently I've sort of broken out of that, and trying different ways of organizing things. Sometimes objects are the right way to do it, and sometimes there's other ways. And so,
I believe, if I remember right, when I was trying to learn Flash, wow, like again, sometime in the mid thousands, I don't know the year anymore. I remember looking at the data function. So I remember it's not up here, but I had this like massive book. I remember the whole idea of data and functions. That was kind of like my brain was just not understanding that. And again, as you said, I think I agree with you. Like even when I was learning programming back in the late '90s, early thousands, object oriented was pretty much that was it. That was what they were taught. It was what we were all told to do.
hmm
So very interesting. I guess in terms of like programming, I'm not sure if you would know the answers, Evan. Like for what they're teaching, like programmers like today, is it still like completely object oriented driven, or has things been shifted a little bit?
I think it's largely still object oriented, and I suppose it depends on where you go.
Hmm.
But you can probably get both styles of teaching in different places. But I think there is a little bit of and it's not just object oriented, but it's kind of the idea of these like vast architectures where they're trying to abstract things away and sort of um, they don't want to think about the processor itself, and like game engines too, like the idea with Unity is like, oh, you don't need to know, you don't need to think about the details of how things are running, or even what system you're running on, right? The same Unity game can run on PlayStation, Windows, Switch, whatever. And so it's trying to abstract those details away from you. And I think lately there's this handmade movement is kind of a backlash against that, and it's saying like, no, when we do that, there isn't, first of all, there's no perfect abstraction. Like the dream with Unity is that you write the code once, and then you press a button and it's on Steam, and then press another button and now it's on PS4. Press another button, it's on Switch, but that never happens.
Yeah.
And so and it can lead, trying to achieve that can lead to performance slowdowns and just a lot of problems, and even code that is written more confusingly even.
Hmm.
And so the backlash is kind of like, no, let's not try and abstract this away. Let's try and just think about the problem at hand and write the code that does that, instead of trying to build up these sort of huge cathedrals of like abstract code. So
All right. Now, speaking about the challenges of porting a game, I think it's time for another beginner's question for you, Evan. But
great.
I want to ask you, like again, when we're talking about, as you just said, I've heard that same analogy used, that people are joking about Unity. You push a button, there's the switch button, there's a Steam button, stuff like that. But when you're doing your own custom engine, what makes it tricky to, again, say, take a game that you put on Steam and move it to PS4 or move it to Switch or anything like that? Like, where does the complications come in?
Man, I mean, with porting any game, even if you're using Unity, let's say it is perfect and you press the button and it's running on PS4.
Hmm.
There's still the matter of, you got to change the button prompts. It's not
Oh
X, Y, A, B. Now it's,
yeah.
triangle, square, X. That's a difficult thing. So, there's never really any perfect. You can't just port something perfectly over. You have to think about, okay, how many buttons does this controller have versus the other controller, and things like that. But when you're doing your own custom engine, there's an additional layer of like, okay, PS4, the graphics work completely differently from anything else really. PS4 works completely different from Xbox, Windows, there's nothing like it. And so you have to basically rewrite all your graphics to use their system. There are similarities between PS4 and everything else, but it's all very different. And it's the same with everything, really.
Okay. And I'm going to take a shot in the dark here and hopefully say something interesting. But when we're like getting back to what we were just saying with like the data and functions method of programming, when we see a lot of games have like the ability to instantly switch like button prompts, like again, like if I use a keyboard and I press X, it will display on there, press C to do this command. But then if I pick up my gamepad, it will know to instantly switch to that one. Is that an idea of like the whole idea of data functions programming?
Actually, yeah, it is kind of related. Um, but yeah, I mean that's kind of a complex issue, but uh,
Well,
yeah,
I'm just glad I got at least somewhat of an understanding there. So that's my point of the day for me. I'm sure
yeah,
Mike and Oscar in chat are very proud of me right
yeah,
now.
yeah. +1 internet points.
There we go. Mike had a question. What do you think of the generic advice of not to code an engine?
Um, yeah, I don't think that's. I mean, it's hard to say because I would say for most people, go ahead and use an existing engine. But yeah, I don't think there's really any generic advice that can apply to everyone. So if you want to write your own engine, then go do it.
Let me do a quick time check here. We are just about at the hour. I think I have a few more questions. I'll give you the mic as well in a few minutes, Evan, if you have anything you want to talk about specifically. But I will say, in terms of length, probably we'll maybe wrap things up in the next 15 to 30 minutes. I think that will probably be it. And of course, for anyone watching us live, if you have any more questions for Evan, feel free to get those in. Now, there is one thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to the opinions of game engines, and I'm sure Mike will leave a few comments as well on this. But getting back to what you were saying regarding the user trusting games on Steam, I've also seen, and we've talked about this I think in the past, kind of a backlash against Unity. And we've seen consumers talk about this, that when people play like crappy games or not as great games or lesser quality, they always see that big splash on the front that says made by Unity. But as I'm sure you're aware of, and I'm sure as the folks watching this, we've seen some very impressive games made using Unity. And there's definitely been a issue of perception when it comes to Unity as an engine. And again, as a programmer, I wanted to get your thoughts on that in terms of kind of like the consumer confidence in game engines like that.
Yeah, I mean that's a big issue,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of factors there. But yeah, I mean you're absolutely right that there's fantastic games made in Unity. Um, but if there is the issue that if you look at the Unity games as a whole, 90% of them are really bad. Just because of the nature, because they've done their job well. Unity, the whole mission is to democratize game
Yeah.
development and get accessible to everyone. And so when you do that, you are necessarily going to end up with lots of people using the engine who don't really know how to use it.
It's almost akin to what we've seen again with Steam becoming so easy for everyone to get onto the platform. Again, we've talked about Steam Direct this past year of literally give Steam $100, you get a store page on the highest viewed game platform out there.
Hmm. Yeah, but on the other hand, um, I don't think you want this sort of like elitist attitude that like, oh, because my game is written in a custom engine, like it's better. Just I mean, that might be true, but it might be more likely that your game is good because you've had to put the effort into, doing all this custom stuff. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily better.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, because like I said, the professionals are basically using Unity and they're kind of rewriting parts of it and really doing pretty much the same thing that I'm doing. They're writing custom engine code, but they've just kind of got a head start in that they're using a lot of existing Unity stuff. And
Hmm.
so,
Okay. And let me see if there was anything else I wanted to say regarding that. I just had a question. Um, I guess when it comes to the actual, like again, when showing this information to people, like as Oscar was saying in chat, that again we see a lot of developers that because they use the basic version, it's forced to show that made by Unity. I guess. Do you think it would be better if it just always showed that, like, or do you think again, like that perception can be such a major part of selling these games. Because again, I've seen people who say, this game's made by Unity. I don't want to play. It's probably just some crappy game. But again, I think you made a really good point there, Evan, about it really comes down to what the person is doing with it, as opposed to just what that engine is.
right, right. It's kind of like saying like, oh man, this house was built with hammers. Like, no way. I don't want to live in this house. Like, um, so, but yeah, I do think they do have an image problem, and they probably should consider, maybe even like reversing the way that they,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if you have the pro license, then they're gonna maybe approach you and say, hey, we'll give you a discount on your pro license if you put our logo in your thing. Versus the free version, maybe you just don't have a logo at all. And, I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
that's
kind of
another.
marketing and things. That's not my. I'm dumb when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Now, here's a question because I'm actually doing a presentation. Hopefully, I did this one last year about what to expect when getting into the game industry. I had a list of some of the major game engines, again, for kids and first timers who've never done it before. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this, and this could either be a very short or a very long answer for you, Evan. But if you were to go to someone like a student who's saying, I'm looking at these various websites, there's all these engines, like what would you suggest for someone as like a first timer to work with an engine?
I would suggest Game Maker still.
Hmm.
I still think it's really a great engine, and it it will serve you well over as you develop. As you first start, it's like you're dragging and dropping stuff, and
Hmm.
it's real simple. But then you'll hit the limitations of that, and you'll think, oh man, I need to do X.
Hmm.
How do I do that? And you'll start Googling, and you'll find out, oh, I can script this. I can actually write real
Hmm.
code in GameMaker as well. And there are commercial games that are shipped in GameMaker
Yeah.
and fantastic. So I think it kind of spans the breadth of experience pretty well.
Okay. Would you suggest to someone to try going directly to Unity as their first thing to learn off of, or do you think that's a little too advanced for someone brand new?
Well, I would definitely tell people to start with 2D.
Yeah, of course, yeah, definitely.
So and Unity is not the greatest
Hmm.
for 2D. Like we've said, it's kind of clunky. And so yeah, I would recommend starting with GameMaker and then or another 2D engine. And then after that, if you're really interested in going 3D, then yeah, pick up Unity.
Okay. Now, I have one more. I guess this will probably be. I'm hopefully not going to be too stupid in asking this question to you, Evan. But this will probably be my last question, just in terms of what I'm thinking of. I'll then turn things over to you. So, for you guys watching us live right now, if you have any questions for us, and probably more specifically for Evan in terms of programming, please get them in the next few minutes because I'm going to be putting up the last call probably about now. So we'll begin to wrap things up. But one aspect of game programming that, as someone who understands or studies design, has always thought about has to be procedural and random generation in games. And again, we can have entire podcasts dedicated to design philosophy. But I wanted to ask you, again, with the work you've done with programming, Evan, How does procedural or random generation, how does that throw a wrench into when you're designing a custom engine or just even working with an engine in general?
Um, I don't know that how much of a wrench it throws in, but it does change things. And um, probably the biggest example would be Minecraft. And when you first start Minecraft, you see it generating the whole world and everything. And Minecraft, of course, is a custom engine. And I think going with a custom engine makes that easier. Um, Probably because, like I said, uh, and existing game engines like Unity are most useful when you can use their stuff that's built in already. And procedural generation is one of those things that's very game specific. Minecraft, you can't really just take the procedural generation code from Minecraft and shove it into any other game,
Yeah.
really. It's very game specific. And so for that reason, there really isn't there's no procedural generation, built into Unity that I know of, or any of the engines really. It's something that you kind of have to do yourself. And so that's one of those things that, using an engine or doing it custom is not going to have a huge difference, I don't think, because in both cases, you're going to end up doing a lot of work on your own.
All right. Mike asked a question. You want to know how far your low-level knowledge goes in terms of coding different OS, assembly, hardware, stuff that I don't know what he's talking about, but I'm sure you probably do.
Um, I pick up stuff if I need it. So uh, if I need to learn about, I don't know, x86 registers or whatever because I'm encountering a bug and I need to understand how that works, I'll go learn it. And so that's kind of you're always learning things, right? No one knows everything, and so you're always kind of expanding your amount of knowledge, and it goes in these little tidbits that you keep adding on as the need arises, I guess. And so, I mean, I've done I think I understand C fairly well and sort of how that stuff works, but then, there's so much stuff that is incorporated in that like, if you're an expert in C on Windows, you're not necessarily an expert in C on Linux. There's so many different things to know, and so I think it's more important to have the ability to learn quickly than it is to have knowledge. Especially these days, we all just Google stuff. Everyone, even people that know what they're doing, we're all just Googling stuff constantly. It's raw knowledge is not as useful as knowing what to Google for and having the ability to kind of synthesize that with other stuff that and quickly figure stuff out.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mike's about to leave, so I'll get to his question before he leaves. And what do you think is the hardest challenge you face with making engines?
Hardest challenge. Quaternions. No, no. That's a good question. I think it's probably more just a general thing like discipline. I think because it's very easy when you're really writing an engine in general is kind of an indulgence, because you're I think as game developers, a lot of times we can get kind of caught up in little nitty-gritty details like, oh man, did you notice that your character leaves like footprints on the ground, and people are like, what? I didn't notice that, but wow, okay, that's cool, I guess. um, and so like I think as when you're making a game, it's very easy to get caught up in that stuff. And when you're making an engine, it's even worse because you can be like, man, this engine it optimizes the use of the cache and it's this and that and all these features, and it's like, well, did that make the game more fun? Not really. And so, there is definitely a something to be said for all that stuff. You want to optimize, you want it to run well, but it's striking that balance and knowing when to stop going crazy and just kind of try and ship the thing. That's a very difficult thing.
Yeah, and the same concern will be said of game design. line and knowing when
Yep.
to stop adding features. And again, that's another hour we could easily spend talking about it. But here's my last question for you, Evan, and then I'll turn it over to you. But I guess telling a little bit more about the future when it comes to programming and engines. You've of course been mentioning the handmade movement over the course of this cast. I guess again, from your perspective as a programmer, are there any kind of like new trends or new things coming for people watching this to keep an eye on? You mentioned, of course, that engine I think Godot earlier in the
Hmm.
cast, but is there anything else that people should be keeping an eye on?
Uh, yeah, I think this whole idea of handmade and everything is basically the new trend, kind of. So Unity itself is starting to ship new features, actually coming out like right now, that is sort of enabling this kind of programming. That's kind of enabling you to think about where the data is on the computer and not so much of this abstract stuff, but like actually what's going on. And so, because they're realizing, like, oh, our games, a lot of times, our Unity games are running really slow. So how can we expose tools so that the default case, for people, for new players, even, or new developers, even, they're able to make a performant game with these tools. And so, and I think part of the reason for that is that they actually, one of the guys that is a big mover and shaker in this whole movement is Mike Acton, who worked for Insomniac Games, and he was very big on this, like, knowing what things are actually happening on the computer and kind of doing things yourself. He's been a big proponent of that, and he got hired by Unity, and so now he's trying to kind of bring that philosophy of, being understanding code and understanding the underlying how things work. He's trying to bring that philosophy into Unity, and so I think that's great.
All right. Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to ask you. I guess one other quick question for new people watching us right now, again, students or first timers. Do you have any recommended sites or books or anything you would suggest, like someone brand new to start looking into?
If you're interested in writing your own engine, it's tough because I learned from library books. So I would still recommend that. And the reason for that is that if you're using like internet tutorials, a lot of times you're patching stuff together from a lot of different sites, and some of them are outdated, and it's like a patchwork. And so I recommend going to the library and actually getting a recent edition book, because you can follow it through start to finish, and it's like it'll tell you everything you need to know. By the time you're done reading that, it's all kind of together. So I still recommend doing that. And then I guess the last thing, all I really wanted to say here at the end is, like, if people are interested in engine design and what goes into that, you can check my website. It's etod.io, and I have a whole bunch of articles about the pain and suffering involved in writing your own custom engines.
All right. Well, in that case, I am out of questions. So, for you folks watching us live, again, if you have anything final to ask Evan, please get them in like the next few minutes. But I'm going to turn things over to you then to wrap things up. So, is there anything relating to programming custom engines, programming in general, or just anything you would like to bring up now before we tune off for our evening?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my website is a pretty good resource for people that are interested in this kind of thing, and it kind of has a lot of, uh, why would you do it this way, kind of explaining, and how also just general tips for how to write better code. I have an article called 13 Years of Bad Game Code, and it's basically going through all of the code that I've written over the past 13 years, and what did I do wrong, and how would I write it better now? And so for anyone that's interested in that kind of stuff, I think there's a decent amount of good articles there. But also, yeah, just following the people that I've been talking about. So Casey Muratori has a blog, and he has some really great technical articles about, that's more kind of like advanced stuff, and he's talking about processors and blue noise and like different algorithms and things. And so he's unbelievably smart. And then Jonathan Blow is another guy that's really interesting with this stuff, and then Mike Acton. has a lot of YouTube videos. Specifically, there's a YouTube video called Why Object-Oriented Programming Sucks. So that's a fun one for anyone that's kind of interested in.
I should
If you're a
watch that one
programmer,
too.
sorry.
I should watch that one too after our little chat earlier.
Well, yeah, it's if you are someone who is familiar with object-oriented and it's kind of all you know, you might. It is certainly interesting for someone. A lot of times people don't really respond to it very well, but some people are like, wow, it's interesting to see like something that you consider sort of just a given, like this is just how things are, and then to hear someone like explain what are the downfalls of it, and of course nothing is perfect, and so but yeah, it's definitely something I recommend to learn.
All right. I guess one other quick question I just thought of. Again, another very novice one for you, Evan. But when we're talking about like genres of video games, again, FPS, platformer, etc., if you're running your own custom engine for a game, does the genre have any impact on the difficulty of the engine at that layer, or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is kind of part of my whole thing that the engine and the game are so closely tied, and really everything is kind of closely tied, and everything matters. And so if you're making, a Sakabon puzzle game or something, you're not going to need to deal with like streaming resources or anything. But if you're making probably one of the most difficult types of engines is probably open world, and you have to think about, okay, I'm dealing with a world that is bigger than I can actually fit on the computer. So how do I
how does everything work essentially?
Yeah, how do I stream parts of the world in and out of the computer so that I'm only dealing with one chunk of the world at a time? That stuff is very, very challenging.
Oh yes.
So I absolutely think it makes a difference.
Great. And again, like there's so many more things we could talk about. I mean, I'm sure just as we can have an infinite conversation about game design, I'm sure there's an infinite conversation about all the aspects of programming as well.
Sure, yeah.
But we are just about an hour and 20 in terms of, I guess, overall recording. So I think this will probably be a good time to wrap things up. If I didn't say this before, Evan, I definitely want to thank you for coming on the cast. Like I said at the start, I am not a programmer by trade, so a lot of this stuff is new, and in some cases definitely over my head, but it's still fascinating to hear about, again, what's going on in the back end and the nuts and bolts of what it means to build these games. And I'm sure for anyone watching us as well, that it's definitely a whole nother like universe to explore in terms of talking about game design.
Yeah, well, it's great that you're curious about it and that people are interested in it. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
Not a problem. I guess I get to feel slightly smarter today with being able to actually understand a little bit about object-oriented programming and data functioning. So at least I get a little bit there, a little feather in my cap for tonight.
Yeah, count it.
But I know we were talking about Tur. You're going to be at GDC next week, so that's kind of like how we try to fit everything in. But in the future, if you'd like to come back on, we can again pick any number of topics to discuss. Let me know, because it'll be great to talk with you again, especially as Deceiver continues.
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely be happy to do that. This is a lot of fun.
All right, not a problem. So with that said, we are going to say goodnight. For those of you watching us live, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're enjoying this record and would like an ad-free version of this talk earlier, be sure to check out patreon.com/gwbycer. Anyone who donates at least $5 or more will get VIP access, and $1 more will get you into our private Discord where we talk design all day long. But again, I would like to thank you, Evan, for coming on. The best of luck with Deceiver, and of course, hanging out with a lot of great guys at GDC next week.
Guys and gals, yeah. Thank you.
Exactly.
Appreciate it.
All right. But with that said, we are going to end things for tonight. So I have nothing else to say. You, of course, mentioned the places to follow through or to check out your work. So with that said, be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. But I think that's it for me. So again, Evan, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of the evening, and as well for you folks watching us. But until next time, have a great night, And I will. Oh, and one last thing, of course, if you are a developer wanting to come on for a chat, whether it's live or recorded, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Again, we can talk about anything design related here, even if I don't completely 100% understand it, of course. So, have a great night, folks, and we will see you all next time.